So, hi, everybody. I'm Lolly Lewis at Amateur Music Network, and we're delighted that you're here for this wonderful workshop with John Ring. And I want to get it over to him very quickly, but I just have a couple things I want to um, say. First of all, our focus is to really make everybody feel like we're here together, even though obviously we can't all be in the same space, but we really encourage interactive participation. And if you have questions and comments, please put them in the chat, and that'll keep things feeling kind of active and interactive. Um, we'd like to keep most questions for the end of the presentation, but if you have something, just go ahead and ask it. And, we may even interrupt if it's something that's particularly um, important at the moment, but otherwise, we definitely are going to leave time at the end for a little bit of chat. And this might not end exactly at 3. Obviously, if you've got a time limitation, of course, you're welcome to leave when you need to. Um, what else? I think we've got a great presentation today that's going to take up the time. So I'm going to get out of the way and introduce a dear friend who I'm just so thrilled, John, that you're doing this workshop, because it's something we've talked about a lot over the last few years, and I just think it's a wonderful subject, not just to get the history of the horn, but uh, how personal this journey's been for you in uh, just real discovery of your instrument in a whole new way. So, John Ring, everybody.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Lolly, so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. It's been fun putting it together. Um, I will say this is going to be more like a sprint through the history of the horn because there's a lot of stuff. And believe me, I left out a lot of things too, but I think we can get it all covered. And like Lolly said, if you have questions about any particular instruments or anything that I talk about, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for that. So yeah, I just a little at the beginning. I'm coming at this horn history thing from a different angle. I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian. I haven't written theses about this stuff. This is a pretty recent journey that I took. I would really say maybe 10 years ago is when I started to really look into some of this stuff. And then the deeper I went into the rabbit hole, the more interesting it became. And now I'm way down there. but uh, but it's really fascinating. So I want to share it all with you. And I think the most interesting thing for me is just that, as a working professional horn player for almost 30 years now in the San Francisco Symphony, um, all of this knowledge has really affected how I approach the music, how I do my job, and it's added really great and interesting layers of depth and um, subtlety and interest to what I do. So let's start out, and unfortunately, we have to start out with a little science explanation here. For those of you who are not horn players or brass players, you kind of need to know something about the natural harmonic series. And maybe, Lolly, you can put up that first photo there. And basically, what the natural harmonic series is anytime you have a tube of any length and you set a vibration in motion in that tube, it's going to produce certain notes. I won't get into the process by which that happens, but this is a process that's found in nature. And so what you're looking at here is basically the natural harmonic series um, in the key of C. And the low note, the low C way at the left there is what we call the fundamental. And that's basically one vibration for the entire length of the tube. And then they're numbered accordingly. So then the second harmonic is an octave above that. But then the third harmonic is only a fifth. And then the fourth harmonic is a fourth. And then the third, right? And as you're going, you'll notice a couple different things. One is that as you go higher up the harmonic series, the notes get closer together. Again, this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. Important to know because I'm going to be referring back to that. And the interesting notes that I want you to just look at real briefly are the B flat, so the seventh harmonic, which is the B flat, written B flat, which means that that note sounds flat. And then we have the 11th harmonic, which is the F sharp, right? And then we have the 13th harmonic, which is the written A, okay, which is very sharp, okay? So these, again, are naturally occurring in any type of a length of tubing, okay? And the other important thing to know, not only are the notes getting closer together as you go higher, but the longer the tube is that you have, the more of these harmonics you can play. If it's a very short tube, you might only get 2, maybe 3. But if you have a very long tube, you can get a lot. So for example, on a modern horn, double horn, it's composed of an F horn, which is 12 feet long. So if you rolled out all the tubing, it would be 12 feet. And it's also a B flat horn, which is shorter, which is about just under 9 feet. Okay, so with a tubing length that size, you can get pretty much all the natural harmonics. Okay, that's our science lesson for the day. But try to remember this because it's kind of important. And so really the history of our instrument starts back in what I like to call, horns from nature or found instruments. And these are very, very old, and many are still in use today. So just one example is the conch shell, which you'll find in Polynesian cultures. If you were to slice open the conch shell, you'd see a spiral tube inside. Same thing, you lop off the end, you blow into it, you can actually get 2 or 3 pitches. Another one is this instrument, which is called a shofar, which is an actual horn from a ram. Okay, and again, this one will produce maybe 3 good harmonics, maybe 4 on a good day. And this is found in Middle Eastern cultures, still played in Jewish religious ceremonies, that kind of thing. Here's a kind of a cute little example of a Tibetan horn called a ragdung. Again, basically just a tube. And all these tubes are going from smaller to larger, okay, in some sense. Okay, this happens to be a handmade instrument, okay. And then finally, I just thought I'd show you, Lolly, if you could put up that next photo, number 2. One of my favorite instruments is the Swiss Alp horn. And the Swiss Alp horn gives you a really good visual representation, there it is, of what a 12-foot tube looks like. That's basically an F or possibly an F sharp Alp horn, I'm not sure. But that's what an F French horn would look like if you unrolled it. It's about that long, okay? But the same idea, small end to larger, you set up the vibrations, you can play all these different harmonics, okay? So with that understanding, we're going to really jump to the genesis of the modern horn. And that really comes out of France, okay? And it comes out of an instrument called the trompe de chasse, or the hunting trumpet or hunting horn. And this was the outdoor instrument of the nobility. Hunting was a really, really big deal back in, when it started to appear. And this tradition of the French hunting horns really, really started to come into its own in the late 1600s under Louis XIV. And the trompe de chasse is a very simple instrument. It's basically just a single wound. It started out as a single wound brass instrument. And they decided at a certain point that all these horns should be in the key of D. I've never gotten a good answer of why that is, but to this day, trompe de chasse are always still in the key of D. And yeah, so there's a picture of sort of the first iteration of the French hunting horn, the French trompe de chasse. And A couple interesting things to know about this instrument. It's pitched in D, as I said. It has a very strident tone. And that's on purpose because it's supposed to be able to carry over long distances and really act as a signaling instrument. And this is where its integration into the actual art of the hunt is important, because there were hundreds of different horn calls that the sonneurs, or the sounders of these horns, would have to learn by memory, as well as the participants in the hunting party. They would have to understand what the code was for each horn call, because there were horn calls for every single step of the entire day of a hunt. And I'll demonstrate that a little bit. Usually, also, each animal had its own fanfare, and they're usually in a 6/8 meter. And oftentimes these instruments were played on horseback, so they were put over the body, and then while the sonneur was riding, they would put up the horn and play. The other interesting thing about trompe de chasse is you'll notice that the insides of the bells are painted black, and that is to prevent the reflection of the sun from spooking the horses that are coming behind. So that first trompe de chasse that Lolly just showed you was called the trompe d'Ampierre, and that was the earliest iteration from about 1680, court of Louis XIV. Well, things started to change a little bit in the 1700s. The horns were a little bit unwieldy and very fragile, and so they went to a different model, which I happen to have one here. Okay, and this one is called the trompe dauphin, and this particular instrument's from about 1900. And it was called the Dauphin because it was developed right about the time of the birth of the son of Louis XV. Again, still in D, but now they've decided to wind it a few more times to get the size down to something manageable. And you can see the black paint on the inside of the bell a little bit. And so I'll just demonstrate one of these calls. Again, there were hundreds of these calls, but I'm going to play one called Le Vue, which basically means this is when the hunters have caught sight of the quarry, of the animal. So it's not a pretty sound. It's not supposed to be a pretty sound. It's supposed to be very raucous and carry over long distance. So then, in the a little bit later, let's say 1870 or so, they reformed it again into this instrument, which is still in D, wrapped more times, smaller, much lighter, more portable. And this is called the Trompe d'Orléans, and it's 3 loops. And this instrument was actually made by a very famous maker named Raoult in Paris, about 1855, this horn. Again, the black paint inside the bell. And this is the form that we find the trompe today. It still exists in this form. There are hunting clubs and trompe de chasse clubs in France that are very popular. Still that very strident sound. I'm going to play one other of the calls. And this one might sound familiar to horn players. This is called Le Halali par terre, and this is where the sonneur announces that the animal has been killed. So everybody in the hunting party would know what that meant when they heard it, and you would hear it from a great distance. And that theme, that's why I said for horn players it might sound familiar, that theme was actually used in a very famous piece for horn called En Forêt, in the forest. And also you find that in Festa Romane by Respighi, kind of quoting a hunting scene there. So that's essentially um, the trompe de chasse. It uses a very small mouthpiece, and like I said, very strident. And I'm by no means an expert on trompe de chasse playing. I thought I'd just play you a short little video segment of one of the world champion trompe players, so you can really get a sense of what this instrument sounds like when it's played really correctly. So, Lolly, can you play that? Okay, that's fine. So you get the idea. It's a very strange sound the first time you hear it, but it's actually very cool. But it also feels as an orchestral horn player. I felt if I tried to do that for more than 2 minutes, I would be done for the day. I don't think I could play anything after that. Um, so what's important here is something that happened in about 1681, and that is that there was a count from Bohemia whose name was Franz Anton von Spork. And he, as noblemen did at the time, traveled all the capitals and courts of Europe to be educated in the ways and cultures of different countries. And Count von Spork was a music lover. He also was a hunting lover. And he was just completely taken by the sound of these French instruments, these French horns, and loved it so much that he actually left two of his valets at Versailles to be trained and learn how to play these instruments and bring them back to Bohemia. And the reason this is a really important thing is because there really wasn't any kind of a horn playing tradition anywhere else in Europe outside of France before this. And Count von Spork brought the horn to Bohemia. It became refined. It spread to the German-speaking countries. It spread to Italy, to Spain, to Britain, to all these places. So he actually is one of these people who most people don't know who he was, but he was one of the most influential people to spread the horn around. Um, and the last thing I'll say about the trompe de chasse is that it's really hard to find old ones anymore. 1800s is okay, mid 1800s, but you can't find really old ones. And one of the reasons is because after the French Revolution, because they represented the aristocracy, most of them were just trampled and destroyed by the people. So it's a kind of an interesting void there. The only really old ones that you can find are in museums. And there's not very many of those. So once the hunting horn spread to Bohemia and to the German countries, they started to develop their own tradition. In Germany, you'll find what are called parforce horns. Parforce horns are in E flat and not in D, so slightly higher key, but they're generally larger instruments and they have a more round and mellow sound. The Germans just did not sort of appreciate that strident, edgy kind of sound that was characteristic of the French playing. And you did also find in Germany a tradition of post horn playing, and post horns are like little miniature horns, which were used exactly for that. They signaled the arrival of the mail to the town. You'd hear the post horn player, and you knew that the mail was there. So this is also where the term French horn came from, because as these instruments started to come into other countries, they called them French horns, even though later they really didn't have anything to do with France. So then, afterwards, we moved to the Baroque era. And the Baroque era was when the horn sort of first came inside from the outdoors, came into the concert hall. And the reason this happened largely was because court composers wanted to be in the good graces of their boss. and they knew the bosses like to go out and do this hunt. So I'm going to write a piece and I'm going to bring the hunting horns in. It'll be a novelty. So the horns came in, and at first they were just that. They were just kind of a novelty. They were used very sparingly. But gradually, the horn was kind of accepted into the orchestra as an instrument on its own. And so we get into the Baroque period. So now we're not using these big trompe de chasse, but we're using an instrument much more like this. So this is a copy of a Baroque horn from about 1720. This was made in the 1990s, so it's a new instrument. But you'll notice it's very small and still has the black inside the bell. And an original Baroque horn actually would not have had this piece. It would have just had a straight piece like this, and it would have been in one key. And that was it. And these instruments were played with the bell up, very much, again, like the trompe de chasse, like the outdoor horns. And I think, Lolly, you have a painting there of you can show. Yeah, so there's an old painting, and you can see in the back there's a couple of horn players with their horns really bells up. And this was how it was done in the Baroque period. And so the problem for the horn players at the time was you'd need a separate instrument to play in every different key. There was no way to change the keys. The instruments were just fixed in one pitch. So there also, if you'll notice, is no tuning slide. So very much, again, like the trompe de chasse, it is where it is, and that's what you can do with it. Nowadays, like this copy, they use what we call terminal crooks, where you can add these pieces of tubing onto the horn and put it in different keys. And again, in the Baroque, there were many times trumpet players who doubled on horn. And so you find in a lot of the Bach cantatas, some of the Telemann and Vivaldi pieces, very, very high playing. Remember that harmonic series where all those notes get closer together. Those people were expert at just sort of bouncing around up at the top of the staff. So I'll give you a little demo of something from the Handel Water music. So that would be in the key of D. So I'm using a D crook. And notice I'm still going to have these out of tune harmonics. So again, it's a kind of a strident, bright sound. No hand in the bell or anything like that. And this is how horns were used in the Baroque period. So Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Telemann, Zelenka, various people like that. One other little interesting thing to note about this modern horn is you might see these little bumps here. And these are a modern invention, and these are called nodal vents. And they're actually holes that are drilled in the horn. And it allows you, if you remove the little piece there's a little hole, it actually sets up another harmonic series, a fourth higher. So it's not a full tone because air is actually leaking out. But the reason this is done is because it corrects those out of tune harmonics. Because some conductors in Baroque music feel that those out of tune notes are too hard on the audience. They still want to get that sound, but they want it to be corrected. So instead of now, now you can go. So it's cheating a little bit. but I kind of have grown to like the natural out of tuneness of it.
Totally,
Um,
John. That's so funny. I love that.
so then that brings us really to the orchestral horn. So gradually, again, as the horn sort of made its way into the orchestra, the instrument itself started to change. So, so here's an example of sort of a classic um, natural horn. And this is a copy of an instrument from about 1780. This was also made in the 1990s, so it's a modern copy. Um, and originally, the earliest orchestral horns also had no tuning slide, but then shortly that was actually added because once you start playing with other people, it's really helpful to be able to to tune and know where you're going. Um, and Also, the bells on many of the old original instruments no longer painted black, but with very, very elaborate and beautiful paintings on them. Again, this is a modern copy, so it doesn't have it, but they were a sense of pride. And each maker had their own patterns that they would use and things like that. Um, the biggest thing to come along in terms of the change of the orchestral horn were these terminal crooks, okay? These parts of the horn that you could remove and change to change the pitch of the instrument. You're still going to get the same harmonic series, that natural harmonic series, you're just going to get it in different keys. And so this is really the instrument of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Berlioz, Schubert, early Verdi, Weber, okay? So all the repertoire by those composers that we play in a modern orchestra was written really for this instrument. And um, these terminal crooks were invented by a couple of Viennese brothers called the Leichnam-Schneider brothers. And they were the ones to say, hey, you only now need to own one horn, and you can just put all these different pieces in together. The downside of that, of course, for the horn players is they had to carry this big box, usually a wooden box, of the horn. There's the box for this horn. So you can see you have the body of the horn, and then you have a whole bunch of different crooks and couplers that you put together in various combinations to get all the different keys. Not the most fun thing to lug around to gigs, but that's what they did at the time. Also notice that the proportions of the instrument are changing. So now we have a slightly larger bore size of tubing. We have a slightly larger bell. Rounds out, gives a darker sound to the instrument. So we're moving away from that hunting horn tradition now very much into blending with the other instruments in the orchestra. And interestingly enough, this changed by region. So this instrument is a copy of a Bohemian instrument. So once again, the Bohemians kind of adopted that darker, richer sound, so larger bell size. Okay. And this instrument is a French natural horn. And so you can see, hopefully you can see, the difference in the bells. This one, the French instrument, still much smaller, much more closer to the trompe de chasse size bell, okay, than this one. And then with these different keys that you could plug in and out, all of a sudden composers started to understand that, well, each key has its own sound. Obviously, the longer the piece of tubing you put on the instrument, the darker the sound is, and the shorter piece that you put on, the brighter. So right now this is an E flat crook. So if I take that off, and let's just go up a step. So I'll just put an F crook on. So already you can hear, oh, it's a little bit brighter, a little bit clearer. What if we put in B flat alto? of a sudden a very different kind of character is created. So, but this allowed us to change keys. So, you know, a Haydn symphony or a Mozart symphony might start in E flat with this big crook, and then the second movement might be in a relative minor key or a different key altogether. So you'd have to reach down and put in your different crook, and then finally you'd end up in the third or fourth movement back in the original key. And to this day, our orchestra parts still tell you horn in E flat, horn in C, horn in A, you know, whatever. And we just, instead of changing the tubing, we actually just transpose that sight to play in the right key. So this is really, again, the orchestral natural horn that lasted quite a long time. Of all these different keys, the key of E flat and F were sort of decided as having the best combination of sound and also of control for the player. And so that's why almost all of our solo repertoire that was written at that time was written in E flat, some in F, the Beethoven sonatas in F, but most of the Mozart horn concertos, other big pieces like that were written for the E flat because it had sort of the most noble sound, yet it wasn't unwieldy like the really long crooks. So this was great, again, for all the natural harmonics. That's very typical of what we might play in a Haydn symphony, for example. Well, something very interesting happened in a player named Anton Joseph Hempel, and he's credited with really leading to the rise of the horn soloist because he discovered, or is credited as having discovered, the fact that if you actually close your hand inside the bell, all of a sudden you get different notes. So remember, we had the natural harmonic series. Well, if I play that and I close my hand, so now, oh, well, that's interesting. Well, what happens if I start moving that around for different notes? And it turns out that you can basically play an entire scale just by moving your hand, and in some cases taking it out of the bell. And this is this hand horn technique became very widespread. Again, led to the rise of the horn soloist, who would go around to orchestras with their natural horn and play. And also composers took advantage of this. So I'll demonstrate one thing. So in some cases, I'm closing my hand all the way. In some notes, I'm closing it just a little bit. But it enables me to play melodies between the natural harmonics. Perfect example would be the big tune in the last movement of Beethoven Eroica Symphony, where he has the first horn play the melody. So to do that, you can't do it on the natural harmonics, so you have to do this. Okay, so there's a whole way to know how to do this. I'm by no means an expert, although lockdown has provided an opportunity for me to really work on my hand horn technique, which has gotten a lot better, but I still have a long way to go. But you'll notice that when I'm playing the closed notes, that the tone of the horn is different. And this became something that listeners, especially in that time period, really appreciated, the fact that the tone was different on the horn, that the tone would change. And composers wrote melodies even emphasizing closed notes to open notes, things like that. So that's basically the natural horn. And I'm going to give that one to you. And so what we're approaching here is a time where, again, the cultural and regional differences in the instrument were coming to be. So the German take on the horn was a more dark, romantic, it's called the Waldhorn, the forest horn. So played with a nice, big, rich sound, generally straight tone with no vibrato. The German instruments and Bohemian instruments were larger bells, larger bore. The Czech instruments were sort of a little smaller, larger than what was happening in Vienna at the time, and they played with a very singing style, often with vibrato. In France, again, they held on to more of that bright tradition. France and Belgium, a clear, bright sound, very often with vibrato. The French instrument was smaller bore, smaller bell, closer to that trompe de chasse. And then also in Britain, they, for very interesting reasons, which I won't get into, they adopted this French aesthetic. So the British style of playing, which developed for many years, was again on French style instruments. Clear, compact sound. So the next thing we do is we move to an interesting little side branch of the evolutionary tree, which Lolly, maybe you can show a couple of these photos. And these are called omnitonic horns. And omnitonic horns were developed to try to address this problem of carrying the box with all the different crooks around. There we go. And these were designed to build all the crooks into the horn at once. And on this particular horn, you just move your mouthpiece into the right hole to play in the key that you need to play in. On this particular one, there were many different ways that this was accomplished. Can you show one of the other pictures there, Lolly? There's another one where you would remove little plungers, which would route the air through different lengths of tubing, right? And I think there's one more, which is one of my favorites. Yeah, which has a flexible arm, and you just plug it in and to whichever key you kind of want to be in at the time. So these are really unusual, and they were developed to try to solve this problem of having to carry all the crooks. But what ended up happening was right about that same time, valves were invented, and the valve was really like the Big Bang. That really changed everything in terms of horn history. So let's get into valves.
I just want to mention
Yeah.
for folks that haven't looked at the resources, the workshop information page, all these images are there. And a ton of really wonderful videos that John has provided of different styles of playing. So I'm going to put the address for that page into the chat.
So the valves were invented, and what do the valves do? Essentially, what the valves do here is they allow the air to be routed through additional lengths of tubing. So on a typical valve section like this one, the second valve here would lower the pitch a half of a tone, and then the first valve would lower the pitch one whole tone, and then this third valve is a tone and a half. It's 1 plus 2 is the same as 3 here. Okay, and so what happened was you started to get two things happening at once. You'd have some players playing on natural horns, some composers writing for natural horns like this one, and then some composers embracing the new technology. So this particular instrument is very interesting. This is from the 1880s, this horn. And this is a convertible instrument. And so you can pull out these little tubes here. And you can drop in the valve section. Put in the tuning slide. Oop, it's already got a mouthpiece. Notice we're still using the crooks. And now we have a fully chromatic instrument. So these were popular for a period of time when players still had to play on natural horn and play on a valved instrument. And as you can see, these are piston valves. So piston valves showed up about 1815, and the first piston valve horns actually only had 2 valves, and they weren't designed to be played, as I just demonstrated, fully chromatically. They were actually a way to have you have to take fewer crooks to the gig. You would just play, if it was horn in E, you'd just put the second valve down and you'd play your hand horn. It was the same thing. Or if it was in E flat, you just push the first valve down and you play your hand horn. Only when they added the third valve did it then become possible to play fully chromatically through the instrument. So this type of an instrument here, modeled on a Raoult instrument of France, was very popular in France and in Britain. This particular instrument. I need the silver one. And the French also had another interesting little take on it. So this instrument is a similar instrument to that one, except it's a French instrument. And what's different about this, if you'll notice, is that these 2 slides are the same length. So what does that mean? Well, this horn is what the French developed, and it's called the ascending third valve system, or the ascending system. And so instead, on these horns, you have normal lowering of a half tone, lowering of a whole tone, but the third actually raises the tone, which means it goes through the slide until you press it, and then it bypasses it. And what this allowed them to do, the reason this was developed, was that, remember that harmonic series, those notes start to get close together as you go higher. It's much less accurate to try to pick off certain notes. Well, this allowed, by using the ascending third valve, it essentially took the F instrument and put it into G. And that just spread out the harmonics a little bit more while retaining much of the sound of the F horn. And it was a way of having more accuracy. And this would have been the instrument that Debussy, Ravel, César Franck, and the British composers Gustav Holst and Elgar would have written for, very much so. Meanwhile, in Vienna and in Austria, we had a whole different valve system invented about 1830, and these were called Pumpenventil, or pump valves. I don't know if you can see them here, but they move up and down, and they're pairs of valves. And this developed in, as I said, mostly in Austria and in Vienna. And this instrument, again, compared to the German horn, very much smaller bell, smaller size all the way around. Still uses the terminal crook, like the old natural horns. And this horn is still in use today by the Vienna Philharmonic. It's the only place really in the world where they still play these horns from the 1800s. And it's one of the reasons why that orchestra has such a unique sound, that very old world sound, especially when they play Brahms and Bruckner and Mahler, who all really knew this instrument. And again, the advantage of this sort of smaller instrument and this valve system is it's extremely smooth. You can just kind of goo and ooze through note changes, but also the instrument just changes color so wildly. So it can get really bright and strident and also just have this incredibly beautiful, big, full sound. And so once again, these composers, Mahler, Brahms, Bruckner, Strauss, they wrote their dynamics for the horns based largely on this instrument. So this is why I have felt it's important to sort of learn about this and understand it, so that I don't now look at dynamics in a Mahler symphony and just think, oh, it says fortissimo, I'll play loud. I think about the color. What would this instrument have done when you try to play it fortissimo? It achieves an edge much sooner than a bigger modern instrument. Okay? And then the other type of valve that we ran into, thank you, is the rotary valve. This is the one most people are familiar with, and it showed up around 1830 from Germany, and there were many different makers of these types of instruments. And what's really interesting to me is in this period of about 1830 to the turn of the century, was a period of just incredible experimentation by horn makers. They were, again, we're talking about set lengths of tubing, but there's many, many different ways that you can accomplish the same thing by wrapping the tubing in different ways. So this is a really lovely instrument. This is a Czech instrument. Still using a crook, but very tiny little crook here. And again, slightly larger bell, slightly more full-throated sound than the Viennese horn, but not in any way what the Germans were doing. The Germans were really, so fixated on this dark horn sound. But again, this instrument would have been at home in Dvorak's orchestra or Smetana's orchestra, and just a beautiful, again, very singing kind of sound. And then you compare that to this instrument, which is a German horn made by Kruspe in the late 1800s. Look how big and massive this bell is. I mean, it's just huge. I don't know where my mouthpiece went. It disappeared somewhere. No, it's not that one, but I can use that one. But this just has a beautiful sound. Just everything in the room buzzes when you play this horn. It's just such a big resonant sound. But again, using this terminal crook here, a la the natural horn. But now the tubing is starting to look a little more familiar, starting to look more like a modern horn. And this is one of my favorite horns. I love this one. So again, a big bell, German instrument, nice rich sound, terminal crook, but they decided to put the valves in the middle of the horn in a triangular shape, so you can kind of see that. And it plays, again, very differently, but has a nice big rich sound. So this is the instrument that Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, Puccini in Italy all would have known this type of instrument, but we're having just this incredible explosion of innovation in terms of design. And so they're just incredibly beautiful works of art, a lot of these instruments. Well, there it is. Thank you. And finally, we have this, again, very large bell, German instrument. This one's kind of interesting because they put the valve slides on the back instead of on the front. But what's noticeable about this is no more terminal crook. So horn makers decided, you know what, we don't need to do that anymore. We'll just wrap it all around on the horn. So this is an actual really long, unwrapped terminal crook on this horn. But this is the beginning of what we call the fixed lead pipe, which is, again, what you see on a modern instrument. But again, this would have been a very typical German horn in the time of Wagner or Strauss. Okay, and these are all F horns, by the way. So we end up in an interesting situation. We have these valved instruments, all different designs. The capabilities of what you can play on the horn easily are changing. Composers, of course, were aware of this, and so composers started writing harder parts. As composers wrote harder parts, horn makers decided to mess around more with designs. And so you had this race going like this all the time. And this led to an interesting little thing, which is that all of a sudden, high horn players, especially first horn players, decided to go to that shorter horn, to that B-flat horn. So you remember at the beginning I was talking about a 12-foot F horn and maybe a just under 9-foot B-flat horn. Well, the shorter horn, again, pushes those harmonics further apart. They only get closer together at a higher level, higher notes. So there was more security for the first horn players, and especially players like Franz Strauss, who were playing first horn in Wagner's operas. Wagner was not holding back in terms of what he needed the horns to do, and the horn players were saying, hey, this is a real pain on an F horn, but this is much easier on a B flat horn. So the B flat horn started showing up, and this is a lovely, again, turn of the century B flat horn. Small, short tubing, and it has a very kind of a different sound. You'll hear it. So all of a sudden we've kind of lost that beautiful, rich, foresty kind of sound of a German instrument, but you gain the ability to play much more accurately up in the higher registers of the horn. So this led to really the next and sort of final part of this, which is when the double horn was invented. So you had this controversy. You had high horn players playing on the B flat horn. You had low horn players staying on the F horn. You had high players in France playing the ascending horns and the low players in France playing the descending horns. Some composers and conductors hated the sound of the B flat horn and wanted their players to play it on the F horn, and they would refuse, and it was chaos. So the natural result of this was somebody had to combine both of them together, both the F horn and the B flat horn. And that's where really in the late 1800s, around 1898, the Crosby Company in Germany were the first ones to come up with a double horn. I'm actually lucky enough to have one of these early ones. And this is an actual first ever double horn. And so what you have here is you have two layers of tubing. You have one layer on the top, which is the F horn, and you have one layer on the bottom, which is the shorter B flat horn. And then you have a way to switch between them, which on this horn is two different valves. If you can see, there's one there and one there, and they're linked together. And by just pushing your thumb, you can change from one horn to the other. And this was a huge thing. And of course, most players were still used to playing single horns. So even if they bought one of these newfangled double horns, they were still playing on the F horn most of the time. And occasionally for a tricky high entrance, they might use the shorter horn, but they still wanted to preserve that sound. Anton Horner was a very famous horn player, principal of the Philadelphia Orchestra for over 40 years. And he was the first one to bring to the United States a double horn, very much like this one. And so refinements started to come along. So instead of that sort of clunky two-valve system, Crosby then moved to this instrument, which was designed in conjunction with Anton Horner, and this is called the Horner model. And now, as you can see, it just uses one valve up here, which is two stories instead of two single valves. But it basically functions the same way. You have F horn here, B flat here. Again, because it's a German instrument, slightly larger bell, slightly darker sound. And Crosby was really one of the major players in horn design right about this time. They also invented an instrument which is called a compensating double horn. So those are what we call full double horns. Both, he has a full complete F horn, a full complete B flat horn. This is a compensating Crosby, which is basically B flat horn. And then when you push the trigger, it adds the extra length needed to make F on the back. So it's not a full set of slides. It's only adding the appropriate length to switch between F. You still have, a change valve here. And the advantage of this horn is it's much lighter and very, very nice to play. But some people say that, you know, the F horn, because it has to run through all this tubing up here and the bottom, it's not quite as responsive as having a separate F horn. And then another German company called Alexander in Mainz took a slightly different approach. They used a large 6-port valve, which you can see there, which is kind of a crazy single layer 6-port valve. Again, accomplishes the same thing, but a very different wrap. But this design, this is a very old Alexander 103. This design is still used by probably the majority of European players to this day. And this is from about 1909, something like that. This horn's 1920. Here you go, Benji. Feel bad for my son. He's handing me all these horns. And then the other big player in Germany at the time was CF Schmidt. And Schmidt decided for the change valve to use essentially a trumpet valve, a piston right here. And so, again, a full double horn, but that valve allows you to make a more open wrap, which means the horn is not as tight to play, which means that it can have a slightly smaller bell here. And these horns were very popular in Germany and also in the United States for a long period of time. And this is my horn, which I use in the symphony all the time. This was made by a very famous horn maker named Carl Geyer. And Geyer learned how to make instruments with Schmidt in Germany and then came to Chicago and began making horns in the 1920s. And this type of horn is probably the most popular design of horn now in the United States. You can see has a single change valve, but it's down on the bottom instead of up at the top. And it again allows you to have a much more open wrap of the tubing and have a slightly smaller bell. So you'll hear people say, oh, I play on a Geyer type horn, or I play on a crispy type horn like those other ones I showed you. These are really the two major players in the United States at this point. And the French also got into the game when everybody else was switching to double horns. So here's a typical French instrument that was really in use until the 1970s or so. Again, they held on to the old piston horns, but with a rotary change here. And again, this is an ascending horn. So this is actually a horn in G and in C when you push this. Again, high horn players would have used this. But notice everything's much smaller here. Again, still hearkening back to the old trompe de chasse. And finally, the British conductors were by this time in the 1930s, they were traveling to various countries and conducting German orchestras, and they would come back and they'd say, hey, the German horn players miss way fewer notes than you guys do on your little French piston horns. And so one of the big British companies, Boosey and Hawkes, made a little attempt here to maintain the piston horn, but it actually is a double with another little change valve here. And then they tried to go for a larger bell and, you know, the more of that German sound, but it never really took off, and eventually all the British players switched to German instruments. So, as we get toward the end here, I'll just show you a few of the more sort of interesting horns that I have in my collection, which again were the product of interesting thinking, slightly different innovation. This instrument was probably about 1930, built in Hamburg, Germany. And you can see it has one large valve here in the middle. And again, this is a double horn, but this is one of the compensating horns. So when you're on the B-flat horn, you're only using this tubing. When you push the thumb down, you're adding these links of tubing here. It's an extremely efficient system, and this horn plays beautifully. I don't know why it kind of fell out of favor, but it did. I love just the way it looks. I think it's beautiful. Beautiful horn. This is an odd instrument that was built in the United States believe it or not, in La Porte, Indiana. And what's interesting about this horn is, so you remember the Swiss Alp horn, which was what we call a conical tube, just going from smaller to larger consistently. Well, most modern instruments go from smaller to larger until the middle of the horn. And in the middle of the horn, the tubing size stays the same. And then later, it becomes cylindrical again. This horn is completely conical from beginning to end. And so you can see how tiny these slides are, because it's just literally a single cone going through this entire instrument. And the amount of work that goes into making an instrument like this is just mind-boggling. And it actually plays quite well, but again, experiments that never quite took off, I think. And then this is one of my other modern instruments built by a maker in Vienna. And it's a full double horn, but again, you'll notice he's going back and bringing back the triangular valve thing from the early 1800s, and also putting the change valve right here in the center of the horn. So, very, very interesting in terms of airflow and design, and plays beautifully. But as an example of how some of the more modern makers are still riffing and improvising on that. The other last thing I'll touch on is just about descant horns and triple horns. And what this all means is that, descant horns are even shorter horns that a lot of horn players have wanted to use for very specialized repertoire, Baroque repertoire, or things like that. The earliest descant horns were just single horns, but in a higher key. So I have one of those here. This is an example of a high E flat horn. So it's just like a regular horn, but it's very short. And so it makes those high notes are essentially along that harmonic series. They're lower down. So it makes it easier to play. But again, a kind of a strident sound. So you'd have to use it kind of sparingly for that. And nowadays they also make triple horns, which have your standard F, your standard B flat, but also, again, a high F or a high E flat, like that instrument, grafted on together. So where does that bring us? It basically, as I like to say, it's kind of like the Germans kind of won the war in terms of the horn world, because most orchestral players worldwide pretty much now play German instruments. They play, the Geyer style, the Crosby style here in the United States, the Alexander in Europe. These are really the big German companies. And the other thing is that all these recognizable sort of regional styles that developed in France, in the Czech countries, in different parts of Germany, in Britain, and even here in the US, a lot of those styles are gone. And because of travel, because of the internet, because of Russian horn players going to study in Germany and going back to Russia, everything's kind of gotten genericized in terms of horn sound, which I feel is a loss, really, because it used to be that you could tell where orchestras were from by listening to the sound of the horn players, amongst other instruments. But there has been an increased interest in horns of the past. A lot of period ensembles are obviously recording music, and no longer just of Baroque, but now you can find orchestras playing romantic repertoire using hand horns and early valved horns, Viennese instruments. There are some boutique makers making really good copies of old instruments. And also natural horn is really picking up and being taught much more now, especially a lot of the big European conservatories. If you're a horn student, you learn how to play the natural horn, the hand horn, alongside your modern instrument. And so it really comes down to this question: why is this all important, and why is this interesting? And that's why I mentioned at the beginning that I can't play a lot of this repertoire anymore without thinking about this stuff and trying to bring to my job in the orchestra some semblance of what that sound and what that style would have been. I think that it helps me as an interpreter of music on the horn to get really closer to what the composers wanted. Um, and also, that was the instrument, if it was a hand horn, that's what Beethoven knew. Beethoven wasn't familiar with a valved horn. So I feel like we're getting a little closer to the truth that way. I think it also is a realization that everything evolves. And when everything evolves, sometimes that technological advance is a good thing, and sometimes something good is also lost, which is something that I do encourage you, as Lolly said, to go listen to some of the musical examples that I put up on the resource page, because you can listen to a lot of these regional styles and really hear horn playing that you don't hear anymore. And I think it's really too bad that you can't do that. And I think also for me, just a satisfaction in really understanding on a deep level, the history of my instrument and sort of how we got to where we are. And when I play music of the past, to try to bring that knowledge into what it is I do. So that's kind of what I have. I know it's, it's a lot of information. I feel like I've just been talking at you all for all this time. If we have a little time for questions, I'm happy to do it.
Yes.
But I would encourage you, there's a lot of great resources out there of great horn playing and period instruments and all this kind of stuff. And if you start down that rabbit hole like I did, you might find yourself on a journey that is very rewarding and has been a lot of fun.
Yay, fantastic. It's been rewarding for us to hear you talk about it too, and we'd welcome questions if anybody has any. I know we have an awful lot of people here, but
Everybody's just sitting there.
no, I don't think so. I think everybody's just been wrapped. It's wonderful, John. But that's here we go. When did the French start using less vibrato?
Well, it's interesting. Not all French players used a vibrato. There's a particular player who was very famous, Lucien Thevet. You can find recordings of him on YouTube. He was kind of the extreme example of French vibrato. I mean, almost sounded like a bad saxophone player. A wonderful musician and a great horn player, but it's hard to get past that sometimes. But you could actually find recordings of his teacher, Viermos is his name. You can find recordings of his teacher, and he hardly uses any vibrato. And what I've been told by my French friends is that vibrato tradition was very much always taught as a very personal thing. It's like, if you feel that's part of your voice, use it. If you feel it's not part of your voice, don't use it. There was never any sort of set, you must play with this kind of vibrato or not. The Czech playing, if you go again, listen on the resource page to the Czech Reika Horn Trio recording. It's a little bit of vibrato. It's not overdone, but it's beautiful, and it has a very singing, lovely quality to it.
Here's a great question from Sky. What's being written now that's exciting for a horn player? What's next, and what's new?
That's a good question. Well, as I was telling Lolly earlier, our new music director here in San Francisco, Esa-Pekka Salonen, was a horn player, and was also a wonderful composer. And he's written some really, really great, also very difficult pieces for horn, and not only in the orchestra parts as well, very challenging. And he's one of these guys who he knows what the horn can do, and he's not afraid to exploit that. So, with a lot of modern music, we're not having to develop new instruments necessarily to play them, but it pushes the envelope for sure. But at the same time, I would also say that we've started to use natural horns a little bit more in the San Francisco Symphony, for example. If we're doing Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, we may decide. Again, it depends on what the conductor wants, whoever that is that week. But we've tried to bring a little bit of that sensibility, sometimes literally by changing instruments there. But there's great music being written for horn, and just go see Star Wars and plenty of great horn music.
That's
So
great.
yeah.
Jonathan Rudin wants to know, how does Paxman add to design innovation? Do you see a horn call article or a series of articles?
How
I,
does say it again?
he says, how does, first of all, he says, I enjoyed this presentation. It put much into perspective. So that's very
Oh,
nice.
good.
How does Paxman add to design innovation?
Okay.
And then, do you see a horn call article or series of articles? And I'm not sure if he's asking if you're going to write articles,
Right.
but anyway, that's his
Right.
question.
Well, I'll address the second part of that first. If you're a member of the International Horn Society, one of the great things that they have is they have all of their back issues of the Horn Call available to read online, to download. And there's been a lot of stuff over the years. I mean, many, many great articles about all this stuff written by people. And I think it's surprising that a lot of people just don't know that those archives are there, but I would encourage you, and you can search by names or company names if you want to look up horns or players or composers. It's fantastic. Um, Paxman is a company. For those of you who don't know, Paxman is a British horn maker, and they definitely innovated, especially when descant horns and some of these more specialized instruments started to come on the scene. They were some of the first ones to be making those instruments. And there was a guy, Richard Merriweather, who's no longer with us, but he was sort of their chief designer for many years, and really made a lot of advances in horn design. It's still basically the same double horn. We haven't really moved too far away from that, except triple horns and things like that, and various configurations of, is it a double horn like an F, a B flat, or is it a B flat high F, or whatever. But we're still dealing with the basic same things. And there are some makers out there who are still trying to innovate. But again, we're dealing with physics. We're dealing with tubing, and there's only sort of so much you can do. But it is interesting to see what people are doing.
John, do you have time? We have just two more questions.
Yeah, I'm got plenty of time. So
Great, thank you. So, was Pavan, was the Ravel Pavan written for a natural horn in G?
yes, it
Okay,
actually
there you
was.
have it.
It actually was. Um, it's written. It actually says, I think, cor simple or something like that, which means that it was for the hand horn. It likely would have been played later on, again, the ascending piston French instrument with, again, that very kind of bright, very clear sound. So, once again, when I'm in a position to, for example, be on an audition committee for a horn position in the San Francisco Symphony, and I'm sitting behind a screen, I don't know who's up there playing, and we put Pavan on there, if someone comes in and plays it with a big, dark, tubby sound, what does that tell me? It tells me that they don't understand the context of that particular piece, of when it was written, what it was written for, the style of playing at the time in France. And so in my book, that's a check mark against you, that you're kind of just coming in and just playing the notes, as opposed to, where's the meaning behind what you're trying to play, and the appropriateness of what you're trying to play. And that's why this journey into all of this horn history has been so enlightening to me, just as a horn player.
Uh, Stephen has a question, and Stephen, we invite you to go ahead and unmute if you like.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to make this as quick as possible. First of all, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
And horns and so forth. I have more of a comment to add to this already wonderful perspective, and that is the difficulty with music history and period instruments is that we do not have any recordings from like 1800 or 1750, etc., for some strange reason. So what we must do is look at the treatises that are written in the music reviews. And if we look at, say, the methods or the methods of Doprat, Dolnik, Gallet, around 1800, we can get a much better idea of what people were actually doing. And if you look at them, there's something like at least 7 different kinds of hand positions that apply.
That's right.
We also know from the reviews that when horn soloists were reviewed, the statements that the excellent ones were able to match the opened and closed sounds very closely, like the human voice. One other difficulty, though, as we go farther and farther back, we know less and less. For example, when you look at artwork of horn players, the picture that you showed about the horns up for Baroque horn has some controversy about it because we don't know if that's artist imagination and was really accurate or not. So to some extent, it's up to speculation. But I just thought that I would add that to an otherwise wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Well, when I went to the horn workshop in Belgium, I guess it was 2 summers ago now, they had a historic horn conference as part of that, which was extremely interesting. And I actually went to a lecture given by, spacing out on their names, but two of the really fine hand horn players, European hand horn players, Belgians. And they've been doing an exhaustive research project on just this very topic of the bells up or not bells up. And they are convinced at this point that actually that was performance practice, both by going into museum collections and seeing artwork and drawings and all these kinds of things, but also writings and descriptions of concerts and all this kind of stuff. And they put this case out there, and it was pretty convincing, I gotta say. I mean, even for the music of Mozart, which was surprising to me. But again, I'm not an academic in terms of having done that research, but I found it very, very interesting. But you're right, it's hard to know what was definitively happening, but those method books are fantastic. And if there are any people out there who are interested in experimenting, learning natural horn, I'll make a great plug for Annika Scott's book about hand horn, which just came out, which I bought a copy right away when I was in Belgium. And she just did an excellent job of really explaining how it all works and taking all the best little tidbits of all those famous method books and putting them in this one book. And that's what I've been living out of during the pandemic, is basically learning, there's a whole chapter on each note and where your hand positions should be and how to do this, and then exercises, and then duets you can play with a friend, or trios, it's a terrific book. And she plans to do, I think, a series of 5 or 6 books going into different valved instruments and things like that. But definitely check that out if you're interested.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else, Lolly? You're muted, I think.
I was in chat, and then you press the space bar to unmute, and it just makes a bunch of spaces in
Oh.
the chat. But anyway, I don't see any other
Technology.
questions. So I guess I'm just gonna really thank everybody for coming, and thanks to Benjamin for being such a great roadie for you. Thank you.
Yes, Benjamin. I couldn't have done it without him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
and like I said, I mean, it was a little bit of a sprint to get through everything, but hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully it raised a few questions, and maybe you can dig a little deeper. And it's been a fascinating journey for me, just musically and as a horn player. And like I said, it's really literally changed the way that I play and the way that I approach playing music. And I think that that's great. In my 50s, I can find new stuff, that's really interesting and fun.
Well, that right there is what Amateur Music Network is all about.
There you go.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, everybody. I'll be sending you an email with a little bit of a survey and a link to the video from this once I've got it all sorted out. And once again, thank you so much for being here. And John, thank you. This was really wonderful.
All right. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.